Have you ever found yourself on your knees, eyes lifted toward heaven, whispering those ancient words of despair? My God, why have you forsaken me? This cry, echoing through millennia from the lips of the dying Christ himself, reverberates within the human psyche with devastating power. What if I told you that this feeling of divine abandonment is not a failure of faith, but rather the doorway to its deepest expression? There exists a profound psychological truth behind the experience of spiritual darkness, one that most religious teachers dare not speak of, yet one that holds the key to authentic spiritual transformation. That moment when you feel most abandoned by the divine may actually be the moment you are closest to understanding its true nature. The void you feel is not empty at all, but pregnant with meaning that your conscious mind simply cannot yet comprehend. This paradox lies at the heart of genuine spiritual experience, yet remains hidden beneath layers of simplified theology and comforting platitudes. The truth is that what you perceive as divine absence may be the beginning of a more profound divine presence, one that transcends your limited understanding and invites you into a more authentic relationship with the sacred. Before we delve deeper into this transformative understanding, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel. What I'm about to share with you represents a journey into the depths of faith that few are willing to undertake, a psychological and spiritual exploration that goes beyond conventional religious instruction to touch the very core of your relationship with the divine. By subscribing, you'll gain access to further insights that illuminate the shadow aspects of spiritual life that most spiritual guides leave untouched. This exploration requires courage, but the rewards of authentic spiritual understanding far outweigh the comfort of simplified belief. The phenomenon of divine abandonment, what the mystics have called the dark night of the soul, is widely misunderstood in contemporary spiritual discourse. On the surface, most interpret this experience as a test of faith, a temporary trial to be endured, or worse, as evidence of personal failing or sin. This superficial understanding does a grave disservice to the profound psychological process that is actually taking place within your psyche. Religious institutions often perpetuate this misunderstanding, offering platitudes about God's plan or suggesting that more prayer, more devotion, or more righteousness will restore the felt presence of the divine. These responses not only fail to address the true nature of spiritual darkness, but may actually impede genuine spiritual growth. In reality, this experience of abandonment represents a necessary dissolution of your projected image of God, what Carl Jung would call the God image. Jung recognized that what most people worship is not God directly, but rather their psychological image of God. Man's relation to God, Jung wrote, is a relationship between his ego-conscious personality and the autonomous psychic content we call the God image. This distinction is crucial. The feeling of abandonment occurs not because a divine presence has left you, but because your conscious conception of that presence is being dismantled to make way for something far more authentic. What feels like abandonment is actually liberation, the breaking of a limiting theological construct to allow for a more profound encounter with the numinous. This dismantling process is deeply unsettling precisely because it threatens the ego's carefully constructed religious understanding. Your conscious mind craves certainty, clear answers, and comforting assurances about the divine. But the deeper currents of the psyche, what Jung called the collective unconscious, contain a much more complex and paradoxical understanding of divinity that cannot be reduced to simple formulas or dogmas. When this deeper understanding begins to emerge, it often appears first as an absence, a void, a darkness, the felt experience of, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" This cry is not evidence of divine rejection, but the first utterance of a more authentic spiritual voice. Consider how throughout your spiritual journey, you have likely accumulated numerous concepts and beliefs about God, ideas about divine justice, mercy, intervention, and love. These concepts form a psychological constellation that mediates your relationship with the numinous. When life delivers experiences that cannot be reconciled with this constellation, profound suffering, seemingly unanswered prayers, moral ambiguities, the ego experiences this as divine abandonment, when in fact, it is simply the inadequacy of your conscious God image being revealed. The divine has not abandoned you. Rather, your conception of the divine has proven too small, too rigid, too anthropomorphic to contain the mystery you are now encountering. And now comes the first profound revelation that changes everything about how you understand faith. The experience of divine abandonment is actually an initiation into authentic spirituality. Jung understood that genuine religious experience always involves an encounter with the numinous that transcends and often contradicts our existing theological frameworks. He wrote, "Religion, as the Latin word denotes, is a careful and scrupulous observation of what Rudolf Otto aptly termed the numinosum, that is, a dynamic existence or effect not caused by an arbitrary act of will. This numinous experience cannot be contained within comfortable theological constructs. It shatters them, often leaving one with the painful feeling of divine absence precisely because it exceeds what the ego can comprehend as divine presence. This numinous experience often comes to us as a profound absence rather than a presence, as darkness rather than light. Think about the most transformative spiritual figures throughout history. Christ crying out on the cross, Buddha beneath the Bodhi tree, facing the demons of Mara, the Prophet Muhammad alone in the cave of Hira. Each entered a state of profound spiritual crisis and apparent abandonment before their greatest revelations occurred. This pattern reveals a psychological truth. The conscious mind must experience the dissolution of its religious certainties before deeper spiritual insight can emerge from the unconscious. The greatest religious teachers have all passed through the crucible of divine abandonment, and their teachings often aim to guide others through this necessary darkness. Your feeling of abandonment, therefore, is not a sign of spiritual failure, but of spiritual development. It indicates that you have reached the limits of your conscious religious understanding and stand at the threshold of a more authentic encounter with the numinous. This process is what Jung called individuation, as it applies to spiritual life, the integration of conscious and unconscious elements of the psyche to form a more whole relationship with the divine. Like a caterpillar that must dissolve within the chrysalis before emerging as a butterfly, your old religious understanding must undergo a kind of death before a more profound spirituality can be born. The darkness you experience is not the absence of the divine, but the darkness of gestation. The second profound revelation goes even deeper. The God who has abandoned you is not the true divine at all, but merely your projection of the divine. The experience of abandonment creates space for encounter with what Jung called the self, the archetype of wholeness and the true image of the divine within the human psyche. This self contains not only the good and loving aspects we typically associate with divinity, but also the dark, challenging, and seemingly absent qualities that our conscious religious frameworks often deny or minimize. To encounter the divine in its fullness means embracing these shadow aspects rather than denying them or projecting them elsewhere. Jung boldly stated, "Only the experience of the self, which is the experience of the paradox, enables us to bear the tension of the opposites." The tension you feel in divine abandonment, this painful contradiction between your faith and your experience, is precisely the crucible in which a more authentic spirituality is forged. The God who seems to have forsaken you is making way for a more complete understanding of the divine that includes both presence and absence, both light and shadow. This fuller understanding does not resolve the paradox, but embraces it as essential to genuine spiritual experience. The feeling of abandonment becomes not something to overcome, but something to explore, not a failure of faith, but its deepening. This integration does not come easily. It requires you to hold the painful tension of apparent contradiction, rather than retreating to simplistic theological explanations. It demands that you remain in the crucible of uncertainty, rather than grasping for premature resolution. And this is precisely where most spiritual seekers falter. Unable to bear the anxiety of divine absence, they retreat to formulaic faith or abandon the spiritual journey altogether. The capacity to endure this tension, to remain present to both the light and shadow aspects of spiritual experience, is what distinguishes genuine faith from mere religious adherence. As Jung observed, the decisive question for man is he related to something infinite or not? This relationship to the infinite necessarily involves confronting its incomprehensible aspects. I hope you are finding value in these insights so far. If this exploration is resonating with you, please consider sharing this video with others who might be struggling with similar questions of faith and divine absence. Your support enables me to continue bringing these deeper psychological perspectives to light and helps others find meaning in their spiritual struggles. Together, we can foster a more psychologically informed approach to faith that honors the full spectrum of spiritual experience, including its darkest moments. Now let us explore how this understanding transforms your spiritual experience. When you embrace divine abandonment as part of the spiritual journey, rather than its failure, several profound shifts occur in your relationship with the divine. First, you begin to recognize that authentic faith is not about certainty, but about the capacity to endure uncertainty. Jung observed that the gift of faith is not something that happens to us, but something that we have to cultivate. This cultivation involves not clinging to theological certainties, but developing the psychological strength to remain open to the mystery that transcends all certainties. Second, you discover that genuine prayer changes from petitioning an external deity to entering into dialogue with the deeper aspects of the psyche, where the divine image resides. Jung noted that the psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. By consciously engaging with your experience of abandonment through reflective prayer, you transform what would otherwise be experienced as external fate into internal growth. Prayer becomes not a desperate plea for divine intervention, but a courageous engagement with the mystery that dwells within and beyond you. Third, you begin to understand religious symbols and narratives in a new light. The cross, traditionally understood as a symbol of salvation, also represents the necessary suffering involved in psychological and spiritual integration. The empty tomb symbolizes not just resurrection, but the void from which new consciousness emerges. Even the dark sayings of Christ like, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" become not expressions of defeat, but profound teachings about the nature of authentic spiritual experience. Religious symbolism reveals its deeper psychological significance when we approach it not as literal history or dogma, but as maps of the soul's journey toward wholeness. Fourth, your understanding of evil and suffering undergoes a profound transformation. Rather than seeing these as problems to be explained away through theological justifications, you begin to recognize them as essential aspects of the complete spiritual picture. Jung understood that the shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, and the same is true in our relationship with the divine. The aspects of existence that seem to contradict divine goodness, suffering, evil, absence, become not arguments against faith, but invitations to a faith that encompasses the full complexity of human experience. The question is no longer, why does God allow suffering, but how does suffering reveal aspects of the divine that my comfortable theology has ignored? This transformation in understanding does not diminish faith, but deepens it immeasurably. No longer dependent on simplistic notions of divine intervention or blessing, your spirituality becomes rooted in the complex reality of the psyche's relationship with the numinous. You begin to recognize, as Jung did, that the approach to the numinous is the real therapy. And inasmuch as you attain to the numinous experiences, you are released from the curse of pathology. The healing power of faith lies not in its ability to shield us from darkness, but in its capacity to help us find meaning within that darkness. To discover, as Jung put it, that in the darkness, light is born. Consider how different this approach is from conventional religious instruction. Rather than avoiding the experience of divine absence or treating it merely as a test, you now recognize it as the very soil from which authentic spirituality grows. The dark night of the soul becomes not an aberration to be overcome, but a necessary passage to be traversed. The feeling of abandonment becomes not a crisis of faith, but an invitation to deeper faith. The void is not empty, but pregnant with possibilities that your previous understanding could not contain. As Jung observed, your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes. This understanding transforms not only your individual spiritual life, but also how you relate to religious communities and traditions. You begin to see that many religious institutions are designed precisely to shield believers from the anxiety of divine absence, offering certainties where honest faith would acknowledge mystery. You recognize how religious language often serves to domesticate the wild, paradoxical nature of genuine spiritual experience, making it palatable but diluted. With this insight, you can participate in religious communities with a new level of discernment, honoring their wisdom while recognizing their limitations, participating in their rituals while maintaining an inner awareness that transcends their dogmas. You also gain new appreciation for the mystics, those figures within religious traditions who have dared to speak of divine darkness and absence. From Meister Eckhart's concept of the desert of the Godhead to St. John of the Cross's dark night, these voices suddenly appear not as esoteric outliers, but as those who most honestly articulated the core psychology of authentic faith. Jung himself recognized this when he wrote, "The mystic path is a groping advance into the realm of the unknown," acknowledging that genuine spiritual experience always involves venturing beyond the comfort of established religious concepts. The mystics become not marginal figures, but central ones in your understanding of faith, those who had the courage to articulate the very experience you now face. The most frightening part comes now. Embracing this understanding requires a kind of spiritual death. Your old, comfortable relationship with the divine, based on clear expectations, moral certainties, and the assumption of divine favor, must die for a more authentic relationship to be born. This is not a gentle, gradual process, but often a painful rupture in consciousness. Jung understood this when he wrote that there is no coming to consciousness without pain. The death of your projected God image feels like the death of God itself, a devastating experience that philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche captured in his famous proclamation, "God is dead." But what is actually dying is not the divine, but your limited conception of the divine, a necessary death for a more authentic spiritual birth. This painful process explains why so many fail at this critical juncture. Faced with the dissolution of cherished religious certainties, they retreat to fundamentalism, clinging ever more rigidly to dogma to avoid the anxiety of divine absence. Others abandon faith altogether, assuming that their experience of abandonment disproves the existence of the divine, rather than recognizing it as a necessary stage in spiritual development. Only those willing to endure the crucible of uncertainty, to die psychologically to their old understanding, discover the transformative potential of divine absence. This is why Christ's cry of abandonment on the cross is followed by, "Into your hands I commit my spirit," a surrender to the mystery that transcends understanding. But for those who persist through this spiritual death, something remarkable awaits on the other side, a relationship with the divine that no longer depends on feeling chosen or blessed, but that embraces the full spectrum of human experience as sacred ground. You discover what Jung called the God behind God, the numinous reality behind your projections and theological constructions. This is not a distant deity who either favors or abandons you, but the ground of being itself, present even in, perhaps especially in, experiences of absence and darkness. As Jung wrote, the God image is not something invented. It is an experience that comes upon man spontaneously. This living God image within has a powerful effect upon the life of the individual, whether he believes in a God or not. This transformation reorients your entire approach to spiritual practice. Prayer becomes not a means of securing divine favor, but a dialogue with the deeper aspects of the psyche. Religious texts are read not just for comfort or moral instruction, but as maps of the psychological journey toward wholeness. Religious rituals are valued not as magical formulas for divine intervention, but as symbolic enactments of the soul's encounter with the numinous. Even concepts like sin and redemption take on new meaning. Sin becomes not moral transgression, but alienation from the self, and redemption becomes not divine forgiveness, but the reintegration of the psyche. The entire religious landscape is illuminated by a deeper psychological understanding. The question that opened our exploration, my God, why have you forsaken me?" now reveals itself not as an expression of spiritual failure, but as one of the most honest and profound spiritual statements ever uttered. In voicing divine abandonment, Christ articulated the universal human experience of the limits of conscious faith and the necessity of entering the darkness to find more authentic light. The cross, in psychological terms, represents the painful but necessary crucifixion of our projected God image, so that a more authentic relationship with the numinous might emerge. Christ's forsakenness, Jung observed, is the human countenance of God. In this light, Christ's crucifixion becomes a profound psychological teaching about the necessary death of limited religious understanding. Your own experience of divine abandonment, viewed through this lens, becomes not a crisis to overcome, but a gateway to traverse. The void you feel is not empty, but pregnant with possibilities for more authentic faith. The silence that seems to answer your prayers is not divine indifference, but an invitation to listen more deeply. The darkness is not the absence of the divine, but the presence of aspects of the divine that your conscious religious framework has not yet learned to recognize. As Jung put it, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Your spiritual task is not to escape the darkness, but to discover the light hidden within it. This understanding illuminates many religious paradoxes that previously may have seemed contradictory or confusing. The apparent silence of God in the face of suffering becomes not a theological problem, but a psychological invitation to deeper understanding. The contradictions within religious texts become not inconsistencies to be explained away, but reflections of the paradoxical nature of the divine as experienced by the human psyche. The diversity of religious traditions becomes not a problem of competing truth claims, but evidence of the many ways the human psyche has attempted to articulate its encounter with the numinous. Even the fierce debates between belief and unbelief take on new meaning. As Jung observed, belief is no adequate substitute for inner experience. For these reasons, I think it is better to acknowledge our spiritual poverty than to pretend to a possession we never owned. Look back at your spiritual journey and recognize the patterns. Those periods of greatest doubt and felt absence often preceded your most significant spiritual insights. Those questions that seemed to threaten your faith actually deepened it by forcing you beyond simplistic answers. Those moments when God seemed most distant were often, in retrospect, moments when a more authentic understanding of the divine was gestating in the darkness of your unconscious. The thread that runs through your spiritual life is not consistent belief or felt presence, but the evolution of your relationship with the numinous, an evolution that necessarily includes periods of darkness, doubt, and perceived abandonment. This understanding does not eliminate the pain of divine abandonment. Indeed, it acknowledges that pain as necessary, but it infuses that pain with meaning and purpose. You begin to trust the process of spiritual development, including its dark passages, rather than demanding constant light and clarity. You develop what Jung called the capacity for dialogue with the unconscious, the ability to relate to the deeper currents of the psyche, where the divine image evolves and transforms. This dialogue is not always comfortable or consoling, but it is always authentic and ultimately healing. As Jung observed, the healing of our spiritual ignorance cannot be complete unless we first acknowledge it. The acknowledgement of divine absence becomes the first step toward a more authentic divine presence. Consider also how this understanding transforms your relationship with others. When you recognize that divine abandonment is a necessary part of spiritual development, something that every authentic seeker must face, you develop greater compassion for those experiencing their own dark nights. Rather than offering simplistic answers or spiritual platitudes, you can accompany others through their darkness, knowing that it contains the seeds of their most profound spiritual growth. You become what Jung called a wounded healer, someone whose own encounter with darkness enables them to guide others through similar passages. The doctor is effective, Jung wrote, only when he himself is affected. Your own experience of divine abandonment becomes not just personally transformative, but communally valuable. This compassionate presence extends not just to fellow believers, but to those who have abandoned faith altogether. You recognize that many reject religion precisely because they encountered divine absence and lacked the psychological framework to understand it as anything but the disproof of religious claims. Their atheism may represent not a rejection of the divine, but of inadequate God images that could not withstand the crucible of lived experience. As Jung observed, it is not the literal belief that matters, but how the symbol functions in a person's life. Your understanding of divine abandonment as part of authentic spiritual development allows you to engage in dialogue across the believer-non-believer divide with genuine empathy rather than defensive apologetics. The paradoxical nature of this spiritual understanding also transforms how you perceive suffering in your own life and in the world around you. Pain, loss, and darkness no longer appear as problems to be explained away through theological justifications. but as necessary aspects of a complete spiritual understanding. Jung noted that there is no birth of consciousness without pain, and the same applies to spiritual consciousness. The suffering that seems to contradict divine goodness becomes not an argument against faith, but the very ground in which a more profound faith takes root. As the Zen tradition expresses it, no mud, no lotus. The divine does not prevent suffering but is revealed through it, not as its cause, but as the meaning discovered within it. This perspective also illuminates the psychological significance of Christ's resurrection following his experience of abandonment on the cross. Resurrection occurs not despite abandonment, but through it, the integration of this dark experience into a more complete understanding. As Jung observed, the Christian symbol is a living thing that carries in itself the seeds of further development. The resurrection represents not just a historical event, but a psychological truth, that from the death of your limited God image emerges a more authentic relationship with the divine. What seemed like the end of faith becomes its true beginning. I would love to hear about your own experiences with feelings of divine abandonment and how they have shaped your spiritual journey. Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this exploration has offered you new perspectives, consider subscribing and sharing this content with others who might be struggling with similar questions. Together, we can develop a more psychologically informed approach to spiritual life that honors both its light and shadow aspects. The journey through divine abandonment also reveals a profound truth about the nature of genuine faith. Contrary to popular understanding, authentic faith is not unwavering certainty, but the capacity to endure uncertainty. It is not the absence of doubt, but the integration of doubt into a more complex and honest spiritual stance. Jung understood this when he wrote, "Religion is a defense against the experience of God." By this paradoxical statement, he meant that formal religious structures often protect believers from the raw, unmediated encounter with the numinous, an encounter that necessarily includes experiences of absence, darkness, and abandonment. True faith emerges not by avoiding these experiences, but by moving through them toward a more integrated understanding. This more integrated understanding includes what Jung called the problem of opposites in religious experience. The divine reveals itself not just as loving but as challenging, not just as present but as absent, not just as comforting but as disturbing. The experience of the self, Jung wrote, is always a defeat for the ego. Your ego naturally seeks a God who consistently affirms and supports your conscious identity and understanding. The experience of divine abandonment represents the breakthrough of a more complete divine reality that includes aspects your ego would prefer to avoid. This breakthrough feels like abandonment, precisely because it contradicts your ego's expectations of what God should be and how God should act. Consider the implications of this understanding for how you approach spiritual practice. Prayer becomes not primarily asking for divine intervention, but opening yourself to divine transformation, a transformation that may include experiences of absence and darkness. Meditation becomes not just seeking peaceful presence, but learning to dwell attentively in the void. Scripture reading becomes not just finding confirmation of your existing beliefs, but allowing the text to disrupt and challenge them. Religious rituals become not just comfortable routines, but symbolic enactments of the soul's journey through presence and absence, light and darkness. The entire landscape of spiritual practice is illuminated by the recognition that divine abandonment is a necessary aspect of authentic spirituality. This understanding also sheds new light on the phenomenon of religious doubt. Rather than seeing doubt as the enemy of faith, something to be overcome through greater conviction or spiritual discipline, you begin to recognize it as an essential component of genuine spiritual development. Jung observed that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, and the same applies to accepting the divine completely, including its seemingly absent or contradictory aspects. Doubt becomes not a failure of faith, but the growing edge of faith, the place where your understanding is being stretched beyond comfortable certainties toward a more authentic relationship with the numinous. As we draw toward the conclusion of our exploration, it is important to recognize that this understanding of divine abandonment as spiritual initiation is not a new or revolutionary idea, but a recovery of wisdom found in the mystical traditions of many religions. From the apophatic tradition in Christianity to the concept of sunyata, emptiness in Buddhism, From the Ein Sof, the infinite nothingness, in Kabbalah, to the annihilation of self, Fana, in Sufism, religious traditions have long recognized that encounters with divine absence are essential to spiritual development. Jung's contribution was to articulate the psychological dynamics of this process, explaining why it is necessary and how it functions in the development of the psyche. This recognition offers a powerful antidote to the spiritual materialism that characterizes much contemporary religious discourse, the tendency to treat faith as a means of securing prosperity, health, comfort, or certainty. The commercialization of spirituality often promises a God who will consistently fulfill your wishes and meet your needs if you only believe strongly enough or practice diligently enough. The experience of divine abandonment shatters these illusions, revealing them as projections of ego desires rather than authentic encounters with the numinous. As Jung observed, it is high time we realize that it is pointless to praise the light and preach it if nobody can see it. It is much more needful to teach people the art of seeing. The art of seeing includes the capacity to perceive the divine in darkness, as well as in light, in absence, as well as in presence. This more complete spiritual vision does not come naturally or easily, but is developed through the very experiences that seem to threaten faith. The feeling of abandonment becomes, paradoxically, the doorway to a more authentic relationship with the divine, one that includes the full spectrum of human experience rather than just its comfortable and affirming aspects. As Jung wrote, the experience of the self, which is the experience of the paradox, enables us to bear the tension of the opposites. As we conclude, let us return to where we began, that cry of abandonment that echoes through history and through your own experience. My God, why have you forsaken me? No longer a question that threatens faith, it becomes a doorway to its deepest expression. The dark truth behind your faith is not that God abandons you, but that what you experience as abandonment is actually an invitation to a more authentic understanding of the divine. Christ's cry on the cross becomes not an expression of spiritual failure, but one of the most profound spiritual teachings ever articulated, a teaching that illuminates the necessary passage through darkness that all genuine seekers must traverse. Jung wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. We might add that the most terrifying and liberating spiritual act is to accept the divine completely, including its apparent absence and silence. When you embrace divine abandonment as part of the spiritual journey, rather than its failure, you discover a faith that nothing can shake because it includes everything: presence and absence, clarity and mystery, joy and suffering. As the medieval mystic Meister Eckhart boldly proclaimed, God is not found in the soul by adding something, but by a process of subtraction. The experience of divine abandonment is precisely this process of subtraction, the stripping away of comforting but limited God images to reveal a more authentic understanding of the numinous. The forsaken Christ on the cross gives way to the resurrected Christ, not despite the experience of abandonment, but through it. Your own moments of felt divine absence, embraced and integrated rather than denied or explained away, become the very soil from which a more authentic spirituality grows. This is the dark truth behind your faith, that its greatest depth is discovered not in easy certainty, but in the courage to face divine darkness and find within it an unexpected light. As Jung reminded us, in the darkness, light is born. This integration of divine darkness and light, absence and presence, creates a spirituality that nothing can destroy because it excludes nothing from its understanding. No experience, however painful or contradictory, falls outside its embrace. The God who seems to have forsaken you is revealed as the God who has been with you all along, not in the way your ego expected or desired, but in a deeper and more transformative way. The absence you felt was not the absence of the divine, but the absence of your limited conception of the divine, making space for a more authentic relationship with the numinous to emerge. I encourage you to share this message if it has touched something deep within you. Leave a comment about your own experiences with divine absence and how they have shaped your spiritual journey. Subscribe for more content that explores the psychological depths of spiritual life, and know that whatever darkness you may be experiencing in your faith journey, it may be not the end of that journey, but its deepest beginning. The words of Jung offer a fitting conclusion. Man needs difficulties, they are necessary for health. Your experience of divine abandonment, embraced with courage and insight, becomes not a crisis of faith but the crucible in which a more authentic and resilient faith is forged.